Hi everyone, thank you for joining me as always on your lunchtime for a webinar. I'm Alex O'Neill, I'm Code's Head of Compliance. For those of you who don't know me, that means that I run our research teams and sit on top of our modules in iComply and the consultancy. So that's kind of my role within the business. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how to prepare for inspection. So if this seems a little different, is anyone who's used to the webinars notice that you can't see my monitor? Probably haven't. I am coming to you live from a studio in Exeter. This is very, very cool, the setup that we've got down here. So we're doing a webinar from our Exeter studio that's near our other office in Devon. I'm down here visiting, so this is a super technologically advanced webinar. And if anything goes wrong, then it's probably me pressing the wrong button or something like that. So today I'm going to talk to you about how to prepare for CQC inspection. And we've got, how many people do we have in the room? 114. Oh my goodness. Well, so thank you all for joining me. Just out of pure interest, how many people here don't have iComply? How many people are not code members at the moment? Could you say hello in the chat? Just out of interest. I'm just interested in how many of you don't, just so I know who I'm talking to. Ah, okay. There's a few of you. Okay, that's great. Well, thanks for joining us. I'm going to talk about generally how to prepare for inspection. You don't need iComply to do this. Obviously, it's going to make your life easier. I'm going to give you tips on how you could do that with or without iComply. Topics that we're going to cover. Types and timings of inspection. What types of inspection there are, the timings, leadership and knowledge, what knowledge you need to lead on compliance, ties in a little bit to the webinars we've done before. There is crossover here. Gap analysis, it's really important that when you get notification of an inspection, in my opinion, that you do a gap analysis and you benchmark yourself against a benchmark. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to look at key areas and hot topics. I've done a lot of webinars on sort of top 5 reasons practices fail inspection, lessons from the first year of key lines of inquiry, going into each key line of inquiry. I've done separate webinars on each key line of inquiry. So I'm not going to go deep into particular areas of how you prepare your infection control for inspection or something like that. This is going to be a bit more general than that. But what this webinar is based on is obviously Code's 40 years of experience of helping out practices, and mine and my team's sort of 10 years experience of inspecting practices, dealing with practices that are just about to be inspected, and how we've helped them come from a position of not being that compliant to passing an inspection. And how we've helped people, obviously, who haven't passed an inspection to prepare for their next inspection, the re-inspection. So that's where this webinar is coming from. We're going to look at audits and follow-ups because I've talked about this in almost every webinar I've ever done, but I feel it's important to talk about audits, follow-up, and it's not just from audits and what inspectors are looking for. And then I'll give you a little action list and some easy wins. For those of you who've been following my webinars for the last 4 years, some of this will be familiar, but I thought it'd be really helpful to put it all in one place, and then that'll eventually go on YouTube as well, so that you've got an easy reference point to look at if you ever get notification of an inspection. How does that sound to everybody? Does that sound good? Moving on, inspection types. So this is really, really straightforward. With inspections, you've got 2 types of main inspection, essentially, with the CQC. You have a focused inspection and you have a routine inspection. So your focused inspections, they generally happen for 2 reasons. One is you failed your routine inspection, and the CQC at that point, you've submitted an action plan. You've told the CQC we're going to resolve these issues within this time frame. We will be done by this date. And then the CQC will drop on you unannounced, usually sometime after that date, to see whether or not you've dealt with the issues that you said you would deal with. The other time you get a routine inspection, a focused inspection, is when the CQC get a whistleblower or a complaint from a patient or from a team member. And to be honest, I think this is almost the weakest link as a practice. The CQC do give you 2 weeks to prepare for a routine inspection, which we'll get to in a second. But to be honest, can we all agree that compliance is just running a legal dental practice, and ideally this is the minimum requirement that you're supposed to be on top of all the time? Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah, so ideally, I'm being a little bit black and white here because I'm going to move on to talk about routine inspections, but ideally we want to be prepared for a whistleblower at any time, because that is the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is you turn up for work at 8:30 and at 9 o'clock, and you're dealing with people being sick and calling in sick or whatever. You're trying to rearrange some diaries, and then at 9 o'clock the CQC walk in and they want to look at certain things. They could want to look at anything. So I generally say to practices, always be prepared for the whistleblower scenario. The other type of inspection is your routine inspection. So the CQC will inspect, on average, they inspect 10% of practices per year per region. So that generally sits with an inspection manager that's at a regional level, and they have complete carte blanche to pick 10% of practices from their area per year. We generally say to people, be prepared for an inspection every 5 years. I can't see the CQC really leaving it 10 years between inspections. I've never known a practice to have 10 years between inspections. So I think 5 years is about a good amount of time to expect one. However, as I said previously, you don't want to wait for that CQC phone call, because you might get someone turning up on your doorstep. So timings. So when the CQC want to encourage you to improve, which is why they give you 14 days notice. In other countries, they get more notice. In some countries, they get less notice. The CQC used to give us less than 14 days notice, but they're giving that to encourage improvement. After a few years, after another 5 years, will they take that down, because they should feel that practices should be at that base level. And that's the important thing, as I said before, to remember with compliance, is that compliance is the minimum level you're supposed to be running your practice at. It's not best practice. The only place that best practice really exists when it comes to compliance is with HTML 105, not with anything else. So when the CQC come, they're going to come for about 5 hours on average. There will be generally 2 of them, sometimes 3, but usually 2. You've got the CQC inspector themselves, who are a fully trained dental inspector, and they are coming with what they call a SPA, a specialist practice advisor, who's usually a GDC, who's usually GDC qualified. Sometimes it's a practice manager, but it's generally, usually speaking, a dentist or a hygienist or a therapist, because then they can talk to the clinicians on their level. What they then do. This is where it's quite interesting, and I've had some conversations with some of the inspection managers at the CQC about this recently, is when they've finished the visit, quite often what they'll then do is they'll request a couple of bits of evidence from you, and they'll ask you to submit it within 48 hours. Have any of you experienced that before? Yes. So we've got a bit of a mixed bag. Vicky Jones, yes, many times. Some people no. Some people yes. That's because it's the one bit of the process that the inspector has a bit of free rein on. And what we find at Code, because of, we're supporting about 2,500 of you and we're getting phone calls all the time, is that sometimes the inspectors go a little bit off script and they'll ask you for something which isn't necessarily something that you need for compliance. Have any of you ever rung up me after an inspection and we've had a conversation about whether or not you should submit that thing that they're asking for, or we need to push back a little bit and ask why? Have I had that chat with anyone who's on the inspection? Emma, like what? Good question. I'll try and take questions at the end, but I will deal with that one for now. A couple of years ago, the CQC a few inspectors got the wrong end of the stick, and they were asking everyone to give them modern slavery policies. So the CQC, a few CQC inspectors were actually asking practices to submit a modern slavery policy within 48 hours of the visit, which it isn't a requirement to have that policy. So we pushed back a little bit. But what I'm kind of saying is, if you're in that 48-hour info request window and you are a Code member and you feel that they're asking you for something that's not in iComply, then please give us a call. Because we either need to put something in iComply, which doesn't happen very often, but maybe there's something new. But generally speaking, in that scenario, the CQC inspector is actually asking for something that they don't need to ask for. But we are working with the CQC. We have communication with the CQC to try and resolve that. And it has got a lot better. We're not getting those phone calls. Generally, then, what you get is about 10 days until they send you a draft report. And at that point, you can factually challenge the report. Factually challenge, not necessarily disagree with their interpretation on it. And again, at Code, we're happy, if you disagree with your report, then please give us a call and we can talk through it as well before you have to submit anything or submit any action plans or anything like that. So feel free to give us a call. So Moving on, pre-visit. So this is really, really important. Before the CQC come to visit you, they're going to collect information about the practice from various sources. They're going to ask you to submit a statement of purpose. They're going to ask you to send a list of people that work in the practice. You can see everything that's on the slide there, summary of complaints. Two interesting points here. Number one is the policy list at the bottom is not well, they do have a standardized list, but the inspectors do sometimes go a little off script with that list. But what we're seeing is that the CQC are now enforcing a more standardized list. So we shouldn't see variations on that. But again, if you're being asked to submit something or have something ready and you're not sure what it is or where it is in iComply, it may have a different name. Policies are not about the names, they're about the regulations that they need to cover. So the CQC may be asking you for a fire policy, but actually in code, that's in the health and safety policy. So you may be sort of saying, why does iComply not have this policy? But it exists, it's just under a different name or a different area. So if they're asking you for something that you're not sure if you have, then always pick up the call. You've got that 9 to 5, Monday to Friday support with iComply. The other reason I put this slide up is prior to the visit, they're going to collect information from anywhere out there in the public domain. So one of the key things to prepare for inspection and to always be prepared for inspection is to manage your public image. I haven't spoken about this for a couple of years, I think, but it's super, super important. Can you see that map on the right, everybody? Can everyone see that map? Yeah, that's where I'm from originally in Manchester. That's a place called Middleton. My accent's mostly gone now, but I just typed in Middleton dentist into Google a few days ago, hovered over, and I can see that particular dental practice has a 3.5-star rating and 3 Google reviews. So I can click in and I can see exactly what the public are saying about them, and I can see whether or not they've responded to it. But most importantly, from the CQC's point of view, I can look for trends. So if I go on, the left one is nhs.net, what used to be NHS Choices, and the right one is Google. If I go on NHS Choices and I go on Google and I look at a few of your reviews and I see that you're not answering them, and I see that and I see that everyone is saying that your receptionist is really, really moody, then what's the first thing I'm talking to you about when I come into the practice? What do we think? What's one of the first things that I'm doing? Asking you what you've done about it. Yeah, Vicky, well done. Asking you what you've done about it, looking for an event record or something like that, looking how you've investigated it, you've improved, and you've resolved it. So you really want to stay on top of managing your public image, on responding to reviews. There is a way to do that, and we do that in a webinar that we've done previously. We might do one on complaints management again in the future. Exactly, be well led. You've got to be well led. Well led is quite often about, if you've seen my last webinar, it's about having paper trails, responding to things and improving. If you haven't seen my last webinar, it's a really good one on how to be well led. So it works quite well in tandem with this presentation. So I'll go and have a look at that. So manage your public image, respond to reviews, treat online reviews the same way you treat complaints. I think that's probably the best way to talk about it. Right, so moving on. Legal responsibility. So the CQC, when they come and visit you, they're going to want to speak to the registered manager, right? So this is linked to my well-led webinar slightly, but part of preparing for an inspection is making sure that the legal person understands compliance and understands where you are with it. You can see there the definition taken from CQC text. Registered managers are legally responsible for managing the service on a daily basis. Their job is to make sure that the service meets quality and safety standards and keeps everyone safe. And then when the CQC come into your practice at the start of inspection, they're going to ask the practice, and what they generally mean by this is the registered person, to share with us any concerns they've identified and what they're doing about it. Now, in order to be able to answer that question, the registered person needs to know what compliance is. That makes sense, right? What do we think? Yeah. It makes sense that the person who's responsible, the person who's passed that CQC fit person interview and has put themselves up for making sure that you're meeting the regulations, needs to know what the regulations are and needs to have a really good understanding of how the practice is doing. So the tips around that is, if you're a principal and you are delegating to a manager, then don't necessarily just rely on that manager, because they may be the best manager in the world, or they might have the best will in the world, but they may be missing knowledge. So as a principal, it's a good thing for you to have that knowledge, or to have a feedback mechanism between you and your manager, because if your manager's off, the CQC aren't necessarily going to cancel that inspection. So they're going to come in, they're going to want to speak to you because you're the registered manager. You're the one who said that you're legally going to be on top of it. So in order to do that, there's obviously some reading, and how can you be a good compliance leader or a compliance manager in order to have that level of knowledge, that benchmark level of knowledge. So I've got three things that you can do here. The first one is there's a really good guide that we wrote with CQC, old CQC, ex-CQC inspectors, which is called Insight Guide to the CQC. That's a few years old now, but it's still got some really good information on it. We have a briefing on CQC inspections in iComply. That's B195, and that was just updated last year, and it was written between myself and the CQC inspector. So, Julie, the first one on the left you can download from the Code website. Just go to codeuk.com. The middle one, unfortunately, you've got to be an iComply member. Or fortunately, you need to be an iComply member. So you can always sign up to iComply to get access to our briefing. And the right one, which I think is really, really important, is who here reads old inspection reports? Do any of you actually ever read old inspection reports? Just go on the CQC website once a quarter, have a read of them. I'd really advise, if you are the compliance manager, one of the ways to be prepared for inspection is to know what the CQC are looking for. And to be honest, there is no better way of doing that than reading old inspection reports. So I'd have a look at them maybe once a quarter. You can have a look at them, see what's going on, and you can see what they're looking for. To be honest, with iComply, we are doing this job for you. We're reviewing this on a quarterly basis, having a look at a big chunk at least once a quarter, just to see if we need to tweak iComply. So, it's good to have iComply, but it's good to have the knowledge as well. So I think both are important. So, being well led. Now, I've done a whole webinar on this, so I'm not going to go in it in detail. These are just the actions that came out of the webinar. But in order, 100% of practices that fail CQC inspection fail on the well-led key line of inquiry. So I'd go and have a look at that webinar, but in a nutshell, what comes out of that webinar are these actions. Allocate 8 hours a week to your compliance management. That's what it takes. Build flex into your business so that if your manager is off, the compliance still gets done. Because if it's at 8 hours a week and you can't do it for a couple of weeks, you've got 32 hours of work to do in 2 weeks. After a month, that's 64 hours of, 32 hours. Yeah. After a month, there's 32 hours plus your ongoing requirement as well. It's very easy to snowball without flex in your business. And as soon as the number of times I speak to a practice manager and they say, oh, we've got a CQC inspection, but we've had staffing issues. Everybody has staffing issues. Staffing issues, unfortunately, is not a reason for running a practice that isn't meeting laws and regulations. And the CQC just won't. They may give you a little bit of leeway, but if something's really wrong, then they're not going to give you any leeway. The leadership need to learn compliance and need to stay up to date with compliance, go to events, watch webinars, things like this. They don't like excuses. They see it as an excuse, Vicky. Yeah, good way of putting it. It's a reason, but it's also an excuse because there's no reason why you can't be meeting the law, essentially, or meeting laws. Leadership stay up to date with compliance. Invest in a system. It doesn't have to be iComply. We are by far, obviously I'm completely biased, but we are by far the best system and the leading system. But invest in one and follow it. I know what it takes for a practice to stay up to date these days. And I think unless you want to just pay a manager to do that, then it's not a good use of your manager's time. It's not efficient, effective business, which is what we're all about here at Code. So train your team. If you understand compliance and you're up to date, then you can train your team and you can delegate and you can double check. And double checking is super important, especially when preparing for an inspection, because you want to double check any logs that anyone's been filling out. I'm just going to have a sip of water. But you want to double check. I can almost guarantee you that if you've left one of your nurses to fill out the medical drugs log medical emergency drugs and equipment log for the last 6 months and you've not looked at it, I would say at least 50, 60% of you, there's a drug that's out of date or it's been ticked in advance. We see this time and time and time again. So always double check any logs, So train your team, double check, create a culture of quality. That generally means embracing it. And if you're a leader, don't talk badly about compliance. Embrace it. It's the law. It's what you've got to do. So as soon as you talk badly about it, am I sure that's water? It is absolutely water. As soon as if you talk badly about something, you're the leader. That's it. It's going to become a problem for your practice. If you think compliance is horrible, your entire business will think it's horrible. And you can watch our webinars. There's a whole webinar on being well led at codeuk.com/webinars. So moving on from that, gap analysis. So if you, so I'm going to go back on that slide. When you get that notification for an inspection, then you've got probably about 2 weeks to prepare. So the first thing that I'd advise you to do is to do a gap analysis. And what I mean by a gap analysis is look at where you should be, look at where you are, and the difference is the gaps. And the gaps should go on a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet should say what the problem is. You just create an action plan for the whole of your compliance for the practice. So do a gap analysis, create an action plan. Now, how do you do this, though? So that's the interesting point. How do I do a gap analysis? Well, in order to do a gap analysis, you need a benchmark. You need a benchmark of what a compliant practice looks like. And that's either going to come from two places. It's either going to come from knowledge, or it's going to come from a piece of software or something like that. So if you have, fortunately in the position that I'm in at head of compliance at Code, I could come and audit your practice and I wouldn't need a tool to do it. I have a tool to do it because I've made one, but I wouldn't need one to do it because I've got the knowledge. That's my job. Hopefully, as registered managers, you know enough to be able to do a gap analysis. You know what it should be like. But we can all admit there's quite a lot of topics and little bits in compliance, right? Like DBS checks or what you need in personnel files or something like that. There's quite a lot of little bitty bits, and you maybe need tools for that. So if you have iComply, you have a benchmark. Practices that have iComply are 10% more likely to pass a CQC inspection than the rest of the profession. So we have a 98% pass rate. So we're confident that if you're following what we're saying in iComply and you're following it in the way we intended and you've interpreted it correctly, then you shouldn't have any problems when it comes to inspection day. So iComply, you can just go through your iComply calendar and go, have we done that? Have we done that? Did we do that well? Should we call up Code and have a chat with them? So you can just look at your iComply calendar for the last 12 months and just see, did you do it all? Have we missed anything? Have we left any actions in related to-dos, follow-up from audits that haven't been done? So that's your benchmark. So it's either sort of the knowledge of a person, a system like iComply, and if you honestly don't have either of those in your practice, then, well, I'd recommend you get a system like iComply, but you can always call an expert in. So we do health checks. It's pretty much the only consultancy service we'll do for non-members is we'll come and we'll audit you, and it's called a health check. And we quite often do those for practices who are not members. They ring us up 2 weeks before they have an inspection, and then we come out for a health check, and quite often they'll decide to come on iComply. But it's interesting that that's the trigger. The inspection is the trigger, and everyone's having to rush. But if you know you're going to get that inspection anyway, then why not just sign up a little bit earlier, honestly, and don't leave it till the inspection date to tear your hair out and have sleepless nights, because it's going to happen. You're going to get inspected at some point. So I'm always surprised people will use the inspection as a trigger to fix it because it's making life really hard for themselves. But those are your options, really. Now, reading for benchmarking as well. If your knowledge, again, we're talking back to knowledge again, and I've given you some reading earlier on. These two documents from the CQC are really good for benchmarking your knowledge. So the guidance for providers on meeting the regulations, when we're dealing with compliance, the main thing that we're meeting is the Health and Social Care Act. Has anyone here ever tried to read the Health and Social Care Act, the actual 2008, 2014 regulations, which are the fundamental standards? Has anyone actually ever really tried to read it? It's written in high legalese. Yeah, as Simona says, didn't understand it much. It is written in high legalese, in legal language, the best thing you can do is read that document on the left from the CQC. That's basically, it's not dental specific, but that's where the CQC have gone through every single fundamental standard in the Health and Social Care Act and explained what it means. So they'll take one particular section, they'll say, this means you must carry out appraisals on your employed team members at least once annually. So that's a really useful document, and I think every principal, every registered person should read that at least once. I mean, you don't need to quote it, but you might be surprised. You'll see, oh, so that's where that comes from. That's why I have to do appraisals. That's why I have to make sure that risk assessment's in place, because it says that we have to pay attention to the Health and Safety at Work Act, and that says we have to do risk assessments. So I'd read that one, and then on the right-hand side, I'd also read the Primary Care Dental Services Provider Handbook. But I wouldn't read the new provider handbook. I'd read the March 2015 one, which I've put on there, because it has an example of key lines of inquiry and what they're looking for under the key lines of inquiry. Now, here's another interesting point. Has anyone noticed that I've not really spoken about key lines of inquiry yet? Apart from just now, this was the first time I mentioned key lines of inquiry. That's because at the court, the key lines of inquiry are just a way that they interpret the regulations. What you're actually meeting with compliance are regulations. The key lines of inquiry are just a way of sorting them. So try and think of compliance in topics. That's why we have certain folders in iComply. We have certain months. Thinking of compliance within key lines of inquiry, probably apart from the well-led one, because that has stuff on top of it about governance and management, is not a good way and a helpful way to think about compliance. It's good just to think about infection control, information governance, human resources, HR files, etc., etc. It's the best way to think about it. So, reading for benchmarking. Then obviously, iComply calendar, as I said, you've got the iComply calendar for benchmarking and doing a gap analysis against. And you've just got to. I'm just sort of putting this point in just so quite often people are using iComply, but they're not always realizing what they're doing with it. iComply is a quality assurance workflow, so you're setting your standards by reviewing your policies and updating them each year. You're not just putting a date on a policy. You're training your team on the standards in the meetings. This is why meetings are super, super important, because otherwise, how are you telling your team and communicating? But it's very surprising how many practices aren't prepared to do that 1 hour meeting each month. Does anyone have trouble with that, getting that meeting in? You can be honest here. It's a safe space. Yeah, I mean, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to do a 1 hour meeting once a month? So it isn't, and the answer is it's not hard. You're prioritizing something else over it. And how does that look to the CQC? If you want to be well led and you come in and you haven't done a meeting in months, you haven't communicated with the team, you haven't given them a chance to talk to you. So in preparation for inspection, do your meetings every single month. They're really, really important, because it's where you discuss audits. It's where you discuss follow-ups. If staff don't listen, that's fine. They can sign the register. Well, it's not fine, but you know what I mean. Your job is to give them that information and to get it signed that you've given them that information and you've given them the opportunity to discuss stuff. So I've got about 10 minutes left until we're going to discuss, until we're going to a Q&A. I'm not sure how many slides I've got left, so I might have to speed up a little bit. You've got, your risk assessments, your follow-up actions, which are super important, and which we'll talk about with well-led. And then you might change your standards. You might reactively change a policy or a procedure and then train your team on it again. So if you go through your iComply calendar, you look, okay, did we do that meeting? Did we review that policy? Okay, we did that audit. What did we do about that? Did we follow up on it? Are there any related to-dos? If you really use iComply in the way it's designed, then it's very easy to see when you're preparing for an inspection. Does that make sense? Yeah. Does it? But how many of you are using iComply in the way it's designed? How many of you are signing off every activity and creating related to-dos? Or how many of you are just using it as a depository for your policies? We're getting the good ones. Yeah, so generally speaking, the people that I'm talking to on webinars are not the people that I need to give this information to. So I'd use, the more you use iComply and the way it is designed, the easier it will be. You will be able to analyze when you get notification of an inspection. You'll be able to see the gaps a lot more easily. So moving on from that. Don't rely on your last inspection. This is quite an old slide. I haven't used this one for a while. But your old inspection... Oh, hold on 1 second. Okay, that's why. Right, so your old inspection, I don't think people will say this anymore, but some people used to say to me, okay, Alex, like we've had an inspection in 2013, we're fine, we're compliant. But basically, when the CQC inspected you in your first inspection, if it was pre-2015, one of the main things that they did is they relied on the declaration that you gave them when you signed up to the CQC for about 80% of compliance. They only checked you on 5 things. They didn't look at the whole practice like they're looking at this time. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. The second thing to bear in mind is even though you might have passed, you might have a comment in your practice. This is taken from this practice. I've just found a random CQC inspection report and they passed everything. But in the middle, it says the provider may wish to note that weekly checks had not been undertaken on the emergency medication and equipment. So they passed even though they weren't meeting the Resource Council guidelines. So we can probably all admit that the CQC went a bit easy with them on this inspection, but I can almost guarantee you that when the CQC comes back to that practice, one of the first things they're going to look at is your weekly drugs check. And as I said earlier, that's one of the key areas where a practice can fall down really, really easily because they've delegated it to a team member and they've not followed up. Happens all the time. The same with infection control logs. So go back to your last report. And with your last report, look through it. And a really good thing is if you're on a PC, Control F, or if you're on a Mac, Command F, and just search for the phrase "the provider may wish" or "may wish," and then go and look at your old report and just see what that pulls up and make sure those things have been dealt with. Be organised. I've got about 10 minutes ish. We might have to go a little bit over on this one, but be organised. This is a quote from a CQC inspection report. Practice risk assessments and policies were difficult to locate on the day. I've been into a practice once on multiple occasions where I've asked a practice manager for a policy or a risk assessment, and it's taken them 20 minutes to not find it. And that's in the first 5 minutes of the inspection. And you've shot yourself in the foot. You're the manager or the principal. You're supposed to be responsible for this. And you can't find the safeguarding policy, or you don't know where the health and safety risk assessment is. And that's right at the beginning of your inspection. So just make sure you're organised, you know where every key document is, every risk assessment is. You can tell a lot about a manager and the culture of a practice just from asking them to find a couple of things or asking them what they've done about certain things. Just a word on policies. Who here in iComply, I might have mentioned this in the last webinar, but who here, actually you've all got it, who's got the safety alerts policy in place? Yes, all of you probably. So the safety alerts policy in iComply has a very detailed procedure in it of what you'll do when you get a safety alert. It says you will fill out a G110A form, you will investigate it, you will put it on a register. Probably 50% of practices I visit actually follow their own policy. They're keeping it in a different folder, or they're keeping it in a different folder. They're printing off their safety alerts and they're putting it in a red folder. They're not using the G110A forms. They're communicating it via email. They're not following their policy, but they're still updating their policy every single year and putting a date stamp on it. How do you think that looks to the CQC? What do we reckon? Jane, the relevant bit is important, but it doesn't look good. So make sure you're following your policies. Make sure you're not just putting dates on your policies. They are your policies. They are how your practice is run, not a document that you update for an inspection. And if you disagree with the code policy and you want to do it a different way, that's fine. It's a template. Edit it. It's your practice. We are providing you a service and a template. Do what you want with it. It's up to you. Don't argue with the inspector. This probably doesn't happen as much as it used to, but the CQC do have direct conversations with the GDC. They don't generally report clinicians, but the CQC inspectors, they don't make the regulations. The fundamental standards are the laws, which have been made by the government, and the CQC inspector is a human being who is coming to do a job. And they are just interpreting you. They're just making sure that you are meeting the regulations. But for some reason, does anyone here have a dentist that they wouldn't want to meet the CQC? Anybody got that dentist? No, you're fine. No, nobody's got that dentist. Maybe times have moved on a bit, but I have met plenty of dentists who want the chance to argue HTML 105 with an inspector and explain how they weren't wearing gloves for 20 years and nobody died. Maybe that person wants to have the day off that day. But the inspectors are human beings. You've got a chance to challenge at the right time. That's when you get the inspection back from them. Don't debate the laws with them because they're the laws. It's not about our personal opinion. It's unfortunately that's not the time to do it. And if you give them a hard time, do you reckon they'll give you a hard time? If they need to give you the benefit of the doubt on something, if you're on a borderline pass-fail and you've laid into them for half an hour, what are they going to do? It's obvious, isn't it? So, okay, language. Do or do not, there is no try. Who can tell me where this quote is from? Does anybody know this quote? I have a sip of water. Yes, Lizzie, it's Yoda. It's one of my favorite quotes that someone I think it's probably, obviously I saw Star Wars when I was younger, but then when I was about 18 or so, one of my friends said this was a really important quote. Do or do not, there is no try. Now, the reason I mention this is language is really important. So if the CQC come to you, and we get this quite a lot on audits when we're out in practices, and we say, okay, how do you manage complaints in this practice? Or how did you manage a complaint in this practice? Tell me about the time you managed a complaint. And you say, well, when we get a complaint, we will try to do this, or we should do this. Not we did, or we do. So just think about the language you're using. One is hypothetical, is an ideal. It's very easy to say what you'll ideally do in a situation. It's a lot harder to say what you actually do. So try and talk about what you actually do or did. And if you made a mistake, be honest about it. We did this and then we did this. Do you know what? On reflection, we should have done it that way. But try to avoid should or try. Does that make sense? It's a really important point. But the language you use can say a lot about what you do and who you are. Right, so moving on from that one. Some key areas. I can't go into this in great detail, but I've got key areas here on the slide, which I'll just run through super quickly. Recruitment, make sure that your recruitment policy is in line with Schedule 3 of the Health and Social Care Act, and you are following it when you recruit. Staff files, make sure that your staff files are up to date with all the stuff that they should be. If you have iComply, you can use M249. IRMA, make sure your radiation protection folder is up to date, and all your team the team who need it have their 5-yearly training on file. Medical emergencies I've already discussed. Appraisals I've already discussed. Infection control is a huge topic, but the main things I will say is make sure your logbooks are filled out and check your instruments for any out-of-date drawers. Sedation is a huge topic which I can't go into now, and make sure you've done your practice meetings. Hot topics is a really important one because we're constantly on top of this at Code, and we have an amazing inquiries team. Has anyone here ever spoken to Rachel or Leonie? They're fantastic, aren't they? They're super, super helpful. And between myself and Rachel and Leonie and Claire, who's on my team, we've come up with an email that we can send you of what we feel are the hot topics right now. So if you do get notification of an inspection and you are a Code member, you can always contact us and we'll send you that list. I'm very sorry for non-members. That is only for members. That's a member benefit. So moving on from that, follow-up. No, if you're not a member, of course you can't, Tanya. Oh, you are? Well, yeah, of course you can have it anyway. Even if you've not got an inspection coming up, of course you can. It's for you. This is who we work for. So it's important to have action plans and things like that. In iComply, this is how you do it. The CQC are constantly looking at action plans coming out of risk assessments, audits, significant events. They're looking for how you follow up and improve. Now, I've spoken about this in almost every webinar, so I don't want to labor it too much. But you can see from this one in iComply, where someone has signed off an audit, it's the infection control audit, you can see what notes they wrote, you can see the audit is attached, and you can see the most important thing using related to-dos, you can see the action plan, and you can make sure that things have been done. I'm just going to go 5 minutes over before questions, everybody. Maybe 2-3 minutes. So, summarizing some of the things I've spoken about, but here's a bit of an action list for preparing for inspection. You're going to get 2 weeks notice. Do your compliance check, your gap analysis. Either do it yourself if you have the knowledge, or use something like iComply, or use an expert. Obviously, if you're not an iComply member, you can always join iComply, and people can always call us up for audits. Easy wins I'm going to get to in a second. Read your last inspection report and search for the provider may wish, or just may wish, because they're going to look at those things. Manage your online feedback. Make sure that there's nothing out there saying it. Be a compliance leader. And learn compliance and stay up to date with it. Review all patient feedback, risk assessments, audits, action plans, complaints, significant events. Look at all of those things where you're analyzing and looking for problems, and you need to prove that you have improved, and make sure that you have meeting minutes, you have where you've discussed these things. Make sure it's all been done. Now, for anything that hasn't been done, log it on a spreadsheet and try and deal with it before the CQC come in. And then when the CQC do come in and they want to speak to the registered person about how compliance is going, show them that spreadsheet. That spreadsheet could save you from passing and failing an inspection. Log your events for missing evidence. Organize your evidence. So you're organized, you know everything is. Train your team a little bit about what the inspection's going to be like. What sort of questions they're going to get asked, probably about mental capacity scenarios, how a patient is greeted into the practice, safeguarding scenarios, how they do a decontamination workflow, how you are as a manager, what they think of you. So, you need to treat your team well, because they will ask them what they think of you. And if they all say the same thing, like you're terrible, then that's not going to go very well. Easy wins. Make sure the practice is clean and tidy. It's really, really easy, but we get very, very used to our own practices. We walk in and we don't notice how dog-eared the notice board is or something like that. So just make sure that you're not being blind to your own practice. It's clean, it's tidy. Make sure there are things that are very simple that you need to have up on display. You must have a complaints procedure on display. You have to have a GDC standards notice. We have a list in iComply. It's in M203, which will tell you what we feel you need to have on the walls. Fee list on the walls. Make sure you've got the right posters and notices. Patient information materials. That's not something you need for compliance necessarily. Well, you do for consent, but having information materials shows that you care about practices. We're going to move on into questions in just a minute, everybody. Comments and suggestions box, it shows that you're trying to get feedback. I was speaking to one of the heads of inspection recently, and they love practices that have comments and suggestions boxes there with clear signage, pens, papers, reception staff professionalism. I won't go deep into the story, but I once went into a practice and stood at a reception desk for 10 minutes whilst 3 receptionists and 2 nurses stood in a circle and discussed their weekend behind the desk. So that said a lot about that practice, that I had to stand there that long on a Monday morning waiting for them. Have a clear governance system in place and some sort of a file set. Help's available. If you need a benchmark, then you need something like iComply. If you don't have that knowledge yourself, then I'd highly recommend investing in a system. And it doesn't have to be ours. Obviously, as I said, I'm biased, and I love ours because it's what I work on every single day to make it the best that I can for you guys. But if you need a benchmark or you need an audit, help is at hand. You can call 01409 254 416, press option 1, and speak to our new business team. And they will be able to help you to discuss your needs. They're very consultative, so they can have a chat with you about where you're at, and they can come up with a solution of how we could help you. Or they can always pass you to me and my team as well if we need to go a little bit deeper on it. User Day, just a really quick one. So I think we've got loads of you. We've had over 100 people in the room, and I think 90-odd% of you are iComply members. We are doing a User Day on November the 15th at the gorgeous Brooklands Hotel in Surrey. If any of you have ever been to our days before, you know how fun they are. Be myself, Karen, the team, Cliff there, who's our events and tech manager. He's a great guy. We are going to cover loads of different things to try and help people and see if we can help. Tanya, yeah, great idea and more dates. If it is successful, then we'll have a look. We'll have a look at more dates. What about our tech team? Are you all going? Oh yeah, you're all going to be there, aren't you? Fantastic. So we're going to have our tech team there at this one as well, which is great because they obviously can help you with the technical stuff. Is that Frankie? Are you code administrator today? So if any of you have ever spoken to Frankie, Frankie is on our helpline. He's one of our main people with technical support. He's fantastic. And if you ever need any help with that, he can call people. Can it be free for members? We're afraid not. It is a member day. We usually charge almost over £200 for our days. We've knocked the price right down for this one. So it's only 125 plus VAT, which I'm sure we can agree in a dental practice. It's not a lot of money for a whole day of training on compliance. So we'll see how well it goes. Right, so I'm done. Thank you all for your time. We've covered types and timings, leadership and knowledge, gap analysis and benchmarking, key areas and hot topics, audits, follow-up, actions and easy wins. I know it's a lot of information, so if you are a member and you get that call, you can always give us a call and have a chat.